During a camping trip, a dead puppy was abandoned, but a stray cat took an unexpected turn of events. The ginger cat, known as Rusty by some park rangers who occasionally left scraps for him, lounged lazily on a large, moss-covered rock. His orange fur glimmered in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the leaves. He had a clear view of a clearing in the heart of the Manila National Forest in West Virginia. The crisp air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar comfort for the solitary feline. This part of the forest, adjacent to a small, quiet town called Havenwood, was his domain. He was well acquainted with every hidden burrow, every bird's nest, and every spot where careless picnickers might leave behind a morsel. Just yesterday, the clearing had been alive with laughter and the aroma of grilled food, as the Havenwood Community Chapel hosted its annual summer picnic. Rusty had observed from a distance, his amber eyes narrowed as he calculated the potential for leftovers. He had learned the art of patience, waiting for the humans to depart before venturing closer. Now, all that remained were the signs of their presence: flattened grass, discarded paper plates and napkins fluttering in the breeze, along with the enticing scent of hot dogs and hamburgers lingering in the air. Rusty leaped down from the rock, his movements fluid and silent. He began his routine of sniffing around the clearing's edge, his whiskers twitching. He discovered a half-eaten hot dog bun, a few stray potato chips, and a small piece of fried chicken, which he quickly devoured. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough to quell his hunger. Just as he was about to explore another part of his territory, he heard a faint whimper. It was a weak, pitiful sound coming from the deeper woods beyond the clearing. Rusty paused, his ears perked up. He recognized the sound, a young animal in distress. His instinct was to ignore it. Survival in the wild required self-reliance. But the whimpering persisted, growing more desperate. Curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, urged him to investigate. He moved cautiously into the thick underbrush, keeping his body low to the ground. The scent of the young animal grew stronger, a dog, and a young one at that. He rounded a thicket of rhododendron and spotted it, a German shepherd puppy, no more than a few months old, tangled in a thorny vine. Its coat, meant to be a rich black and tan, was matted with mud and leaves, and its eyes were wide with fear and confusion. The puppy struggled weakly, its whimpers turning into yelps of pain as the thorns dug into its skin. It was clearly lost, separated from its owner, and utterly helpless. Rusty observed for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could easily walk away. The puppy was not his concern, just another casualty of the wilderness, a testament to the harsh realities of survival. Yet something held him back. Perhaps it was the puppy's utter vulnerability, the way it looked at him with a mix of fear and pleading. Or maybe it was a flicker of memory, a ghost of his own kittenhood, long before he had become the hardened survivor. He was today. He couldn't explain it, but he couldn't simply leave. He approached the puppy cautiously, making a soft chirping sound, a sound he hadn't used since he was a kitten. The puppy stopped struggling and looked at him, its tail giving a tentative wag. Rusty gently nudged the vine with his paw, carefully pulling it away from the puppy's leg. The puppy yelped again, but seemed to understand that Rusty was trying to help. Once freed, it collapsed onto the ground, exhausted, and tentatively licked Rusty's paw, a gesture of gratitude. Rusty recoiled slightly. He was unaccustomed to such displays of affection. Scanning the woods, he saw no sign of the puppy's owner, no scent of humans nearby. The puppy had clearly been lost for some time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, the air grew colder. The puppy shivered, pressing itself against Rusty's side. Despite his usual preference for solitude, he didn't move away. He felt the puppy's thin body, trembling, heard its soft whimpering breaths. He knew the puppy wouldn't survive the night alone. Looking back towards the clearing, towards the faint lights of Havenwood in the distance, he recalled the dangers of the human world. Cars, unfriendly, dogs, and people who didn't like stray cats. But he also knew the puppy had no chance in the wilderness. A decision formed in his mind, one that surprised even him. He would lead the puppy towards the town, towards the possibility of help. It was a risk, but one he was unexpectedly willing to take. Rusty started walking slowly towards the edge of the woods, the puppy weak and limping, struggling to keep up. He paused frequently, waiting for the puppy to catch its breath. The night was filled with the sounds of the forest, the hooting of owls, the rustling of leaves, and the distant howl of a coyote. The puppy whimpered, pressing closer to Rusty's side. For the first time in a long while, the cat felt a sense of responsibility, a burden he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The wilderness had thrown them together, a mismatched pair bound by shared loss and a desperate need for survival. The morning sun, a pale disk through the high canopy, offered little warmth. Rusty awoke stiff and hungry, the puppy curled up beside him, its head resting on Rusty's flank. It was still asleep, its breathing shallow and uneven. Rusty nudged it gently with his paw, and the puppy stirred, blinking its eyes and letting out a weak whine. Rusty knew they had to keep moving. The longer they stayed in the woods, the weaker the puppy would become. He started walking, heading in the direction they had traveled the previous night. The puppy struggled to its feet, its legs shaky, stumbling after Rusty. The terrain was rough, a tangle of undergrowth, fallen logs, and rocky outcrops. Rusty, agile and experienced, navigated it easily, while the puppy, clumsy and inexperienced, tripped frequently, falling and whimpering. Rusty would stop and wait, his patience wearing thin, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon the pup. Hunger gnawed at Rusty's stomach. He hadn't eaten a proper meal since the remnants of the picnic. Scanning the surroundings, his senses alert for any sign of prey, he spotted a mouse darting through the undergrowth and gave chase. His movements were swift and silent, and he caught it quickly, killing it with a swift bite. He ate most of the mouse, the small bones crunching between his teeth. A pang of guilt washed over him as he looked at the puppy, who was watching him with wide, hungry eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then nudged the remaining portion of the mouse towards the puppy. It wasn't much, but it was something. The puppy devoured the offering, its tail wagging weakly, and licked Rusty's paw again, a gesture of gratitude that the cat found increasingly less irritating. He realized with a flicker of surprise that he was starting to care about the puppy's well-being. This was a dangerous development. Caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury a stray cat couldn't afford. They continued their journey, the puppy's condition visibly worsening. Its coat was dull and matted, its eyes sunken, and it was becoming increasingly lethargic, barely able to walk. Rusty knew that if they didn't reach the town soon, the puppy wouldn't make it. Thirst was another pressing issue. They hadn't found any water since leaving the small stream near where Rusty had found the puppy tangled. Rusty's throat was parched, and the puppy's tongue lolled out, its breathing labored. He remembered a small creek that ran along the edge of the woods, closer to the town, and veered in that direction, hoping it wasn't dry. The journey to the creek was arduous. The puppy collapsed several times, its body trembling with exhaustion. Rusty had to nudge it repeatedly to get it moving again. He was starting to feel the strain himself, his energy reserves dwindling. Finally, they reached the creek. It was little more than a trickle, but it was enough. Rusty lapped at the water, feeling the cool liquid soothe his parched throat. The puppy drank greedily, its whole body shaking. The water revived them somewhat, but it wasn't enough to sustain them for long. They rested by the creek for a while, the puppy dozing fitfully. Rusty remained alert, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He knew they were getting closer to the town, which meant increased danger. As the afternoon wore on, they started moving again. The woods began to thin, giving way to open fields. Rusty could see the rooftops of houses in the distance, the scent of wood smoke and cooking food drifting on the breeze. The puppy, sensing the proximity of humans, started to whine and pull in the direction of the town. Rusty's caution increased. He knew the dangers that awaited them. Cars, dogs, and unfriendly people were all potential threats. He kept to the edge of the fields, using the tall grass forecover. The puppy, oblivious to the danger, stumbled along beside him. Suddenly, a car, roared past on a nearby road, its engine a deafening roar. The puppy yelped in terror and cowered against Rusty. Rusty hissed, his fur bristling. He realized how vulnerable they were, exposed in the open field. He nudged the puppy forward, urging it to move faster. They had to reach the cover of the houses before another car came along. They were almost there, just a few hundred yards from the first houses on the outskirts of Havenwood. The puppy was limping badly, its energy almost completely depleted. Rusty spotted Asmall overgrown garden behind one of the houses. It looked like a relatively safe place to rest and assess the situation. He guided the puppy towards it, pushing through a gap in the hedge. They collapsed in the tall grass, hidden from view. The shared hardship had forged a bond between them, a fragile alliance against the dangers of the world. Rusty, the hardened stray, had found himself responsible for a creature even more vulnerable than himself, and the weight of that responsibility was starting to feel heavy. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown garden, creating pockets of cool shade. Rusty, exhausted but still wary, licked his paws and smoothed down his fur. The puppy lay beside him, panting heavily, its eyes half closed. The faint sounds of Havenwood, children playing, a lawnmower buzzing, the distant clang of a church bell, drifted on the breeze. Rusty studied the houses around them. They were mostly older homes with peeling paint and slightly ramshackle porches. Some had neatly tended gardens, while others were neglected like the one they were hiding in. It was a quiet residential street, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and life moved at a slower pace. This was a far cry from the bustling city streets he had known in his younger days, before he had found his way to this quiet mountain, Haven. He knew that staying hidden in the garden wasn't a long-term solution. The puppy needed food and proper care, and Rusty needed to assess the risks of venturing further into the town. He was familiar with the outskirts of Havenwood, having occasionally scavenged for scraps near the local grocery store, but he had always avoided close contact with humans. The puppy whimpered, breaking Rusty's train of thought. It tried to stand, but its legs buckled and it collapsed again, looking at Rusty with pleading eyes, its tail thumping weakly against the ground. Rusty felt a pang of sympathy, a feeling he was still struggling to reconcile with his survival instincts. He decided to take a calculated risk. He would scout the immediate area for any signs of potential help. An open door, a bowl of pet food left outside, any indication of kindness. He also needed to be wary of potential dangers. Other dogs, unfriendly cats, and people who might chase him away or worse. He nudged the puppy gently, indicating that it should stay put. The puppy whined again but seemed to understand. Rusty slipped through the gap in the hedge and onto the sidewalk, moving cautiously, keeping low to the ground, his senses on high alert. He walked along the street, staying close to the houses and using the shadows for cover. He noticed a house with a brightly colored flower garden in front. An elderly woman was kneeling among the flowers, her back to him. She wore a faded floral dress and a straw hat, humming softly to herself. She seemed harmless enough. Rusty continued his reconnaissance. He saw a house with a dog bowl on the porch, but a large barking dog chained in the yard deterred him. He spotted another house with a cat flap in the door, but the scent of a territorial tomcat warned him. Away. Just as he was about to return to the puppy, he heard the sound of children's laughter. He looked across the street and saw a group of children playing in a park, throwing a ball, their faces bright with excitement. A pang of longing went through Rusty. He had never known the carefree joy of play, his life always a struggle for survival. He shook off the feeling and focused on his mission. Returning to the overgrown garden, he assessed his options. The elderly woman with the flowers seemed like the best choice. She appeared gentle and kind, and her house was relatively quiet and safe. He nudged the puppy again, this time urging it to follow him. The puppy struggled to its feet, its legs trembling, and limped after Rusty. They crept through the gap in the hedge and onto the sidewalk. Rusty led the puppy towards the house with the flower garden. The elderly woman was still there, tending to her roses. Driven by instinct and desperation, the puppy started to whine louder and stumbled towards her, its tail wagging weakly. The woman turned, startled by the sound. She saw the puppy, its emaciated body and pleading eyes, and her expression softened immediately. "Well, hello there, little one," she said. "Where did you come from? You look lost and hungry." The puppy collapsed at her feet, whimpering. Rusty watched from the shadows of the hedge, his amber eyes fixed on the woman, ready to fleet the first sign of danger. But something told him this woman was different. She was kind and seemed to be their best hope. Sarah, as the elderly woman was called, gently scooped up the trembling puppy, cradling it in her arms and feeling the fragility of its bones beneath its matted fur. Her heart ached at the sight of its condition. Having always had a soft spot for animals, she had cared for numerous strays throughout her life. "You poor thing," she murmured, stroking the puppy's head. "Your skin and bones. Let's get you inside and see what we can do." She carried the puppy into her house, a cozy, old-fashioned bungalow filled with the scent of lavender and freshly baked bread. The living room was adorned with knickknacks, and an old grandfather clock ticked softly in the hall. She placed the puppy gently on a soft rug, where it lay exhausted, its eyes watching her every move. Sarah examined the puppy more closely, noting the matted fur, ticks clinging to its skin, and sores on its paws. It was clearly a German Shepherd, a beautiful breed but in terrible shape. She estimated it to be no more than 4 or 5 months old. Filling a bowl with water, she placed it before the puppy, which lapped at the water greedily, its whole body shaking. Sarah then went to the kitchen, found some leftover chicken and rice, warmed it up and offered it to the puppy, which ate ravenously as if it hadn't eaten in days. While the puppy ate, Sarah filled a basin with warm water and added some gentle pet shampoo. She carefully bathed the puppy, removing the dirt and grime and picking off the ticks. The puppy whimpered at first, but seemed to understand that Sarah was trying to help, allowing her to handle it, its tail giving a tentative wag. As Sarah was drying the puppy with a soft towel, she noticed a movement in the bushes outside her living room window. A flash of orange fur and a pair of amber eyes were watching her intently. It was a cat, a rather scruffy-looking ginger tom. Sarah recognized the cat. She had seen it lurking around her yard occasionally, but it had always been wary and skittish. She suspected it was a stray, one of the many that roamed the outskirts of Haven Wood. Realizing that the cat and the puppy must have been together seeking help, a wave of admiration for the cat washed over her. It was a remarkable act of compassion, a testament to the unexpected bonds that could form between creatures in need. Sarah went to the kitchen and filled a small bowl with milk, placing it on the porch as a gesture of goodwill to the watchful cat. She then returned to the living room, where the puppy was now curled up on the rug, fast asleep. Sitting in her armchair, Sarah watched the puppy sleep, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She had lived alone since her husband George had passed, away 5 years ago, and the house had felt empty without him, the sound of his laughter and the warmth of his presence. Caring for this lost puppy and perhaps the stray cat filled a void she hadn't realized was so profound. She knew she couldn't keep the puppy. She was getting older, and her health wasn't what it used to be. A young, energetic German Shepherd needed a proper home, a family who could give it the attention and care it deserved. But for now, she would provide it with a safe haven, a place to heal and recover. Glancing out the window again, she saw the ginger cat still there, sitting on the edge of the porch, cautiously lapping at the milk. Sarah smiled, sensing that this unlikely pair, the lost puppy and the stray cat, were about to change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The kindness she had shown them was already returning to her, filling her home with warmth and purpose she hadn't felt in years. The milk bowl was empty, and Rusty, still perched on the edge of Sarah's porch, meticulously licked his whiskers, clean. He felt a cautious sense of relief. The puppy he had started to think of as Shep, a name he had overheard Sarah use, was safe, at least for now. The old woman seemed genuinely kind, and her house was warm and comfortable. Head glanced through the living room window. Shep was curled up on a rug, fast asleep, looking much better already, cleaner and more relaxed. Rusty felt a strange mix of emotions, a sense of accomplishment, a flicker of pride, and a growing unease. He was a loner, accustomed to relying only on himself. This newfound connection with Shep and now with Sarah was unsettling. Over the next few days, a routine established itself. Sarah cared for Shep with unwavering dedication, feeding him small, regular meals and gradually increasing the portions as his strength returned. She administered medication for the worms she discovered and applied antiseptic cream to the sores on his paws. She took him for short walks in the yard, careful not to overexert him. Rusty remained a constant presence, observing from a distance. He spent most of his time in Sarah's garden, hiding among the flowers and bushes. He accepted the food Sarah left out for him each morning and evening, a mix of dry kibble and canned tuna, a feast compared to his usual scavenged meals. Gradually, he became more comfortable in Sarah's presence, allowing her to approach him and stroke his fur, though he still maintained a degree of aloofness. He wouldn't enter the house, preferring the freedom of the outdoors, but he found himself drawn to the warmth and safety of Sarah's yard. Shep, meanwhile, was thriving. His coat began to regain its shine, his eyes bright and alert, and he started to gain weight. He was still weak, but his puppyish energy was returning. He followed Sarah around the house, his tail wagging constantly. He tried to play with Rusty, pouncing and barking playfully, but the cat usually responded with a hiss and a swat, maintaining his dignified distance. Despite Rusty's attempts to remain detached, a bond was forming between him and Shep. They would often lie together in the sun, Shep resting his head on Rusty's flank. Rusty would tolerate this, even seeming to enjoy the puppy's warmth. They had shared a harrowing experience, and that shared hardship had created a connection that transcended their different species. Sarah, observing their interactions, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had brought these two lost souls together, providing them with a temporary sanctuary. She had also started making inquiries around Havenwood about Shep. She put up posters at the local grocery store, the post office, and the veterinary clinic describing the puppy and asking if anyone recognized him. She contacted the local animal shelter, but no one had reported a missing German Shepherd puppy. She knew that Shep couldn't stay with her forever. She was simply too old to handle a large, energetic dog. She hoped that his owners would be found, but as the days passed, that hope dwindled. She began to consider other options, thinking about finding him a good, permanent home. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch watching Rusty and Shep playing in the yard, she felt a pang of sadness. She had grown attached to both of them, especially Shep. The thought of him leaving filled her with a sense of loss, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She had to think about what was best for Shep and for Rusty, too. She had a feeling that Rusty, despite his independent nature, would miss Shep terribly. She watched as Shep, in a burst of puppyish exuberance, chased a butterfly across the lawn. Rusty, pretending to be uninterested, followed at a distance, his eyes fixed on the puppy. Sarah smiled. This unlikely friendship, forged in the wilderness, had brought a spark of joy back into her quiet life. She knew that whatever happened, she would never forget them. A week later, Sarah's grandson Michael came to visit. He was a tall, broad-shouldered young man with a kind smile and gentle eyes that reminded Sarah of her late husband. He lived on a small farm about Ann Howard outside of Havenwood, raising chickens and a few sheep. He often visited Sarah, helping her with chores around the house and keeping her company. As soon as Michael stepped into the living room, he was greeted by Shep, who bounded towards him, tail wagging furiously. Michael laughed, crouching down to pet the puppy. "Well, hello there, fella," he said. "Grandma, where did you find this little guy?" Sarah explained the story of how Shep and Rusty had arrived at her doorstep, their journey from the woods and their shared hardship. Michael listened intently, his expression softening as he heard about their plight. He continued to pet Shep, who was now licking his face with enthusiastic affection. "He's a beautiful dog, Grandma," Michael said. "A German Shepherd, right?" "Yes," Sarah replied. "I've been trying to find his owners, but no one has come forward. I'm afraid he was abandoned." Michael looked at Shep, his eyes filled with compassion. He had always wanted a dog, but his busy life on the farm had made it difficult. He spent the afternoon playing with Shep in the yard, throwing a ball and watching him run with joyful abandon. Rusty watched from the shadows of the flower garden, his usual aloofness tinged with a hint of jealousy. As the sun began to set, Sarah and Michael sat on the porch drinking iced tea. Shep lay at Michael's feet, panting contentedly. Taking a deep breath, Sarah broached the subject that had been on her mind for days. "Michael," she said, "I've been thinking. I'm not really able to care for Shep long term. He needs someone who can give him the exercise and attention he requires. I was wondering, would you consider taking him?" Michael looked surprised, but not entirely opposed to the idea. He stroked Shep's head thoughtfully. "I've always wanted a dog, Grandma," he said. "I have plenty of space on the farm. He'd be good company and could help keep an eye on the livestock." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "But what about you, Grandma? You've grown attached to him." Sarah smiled sadly. "I have," she admitted. "But I know this is the best thing for him, and I'll still get to see him when you visit." Michael nodded, understanding. He looked at Shep, who was gazing up at him with adoring eyes. "Okay, Grandma," he said. "I'll take him. I'll give him a good home." Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with a pang of sadness. She knew this was the right decision, but it didn't make it any easier. The next morning, Michael prepared to leave with Shep. He'd brought a dog crate with him, which he placed in the back of his pickup truck. He thanked Sarah for everything she had done, promising to bring Shep back to visit often. Shep, sensing a change, seemed a little apprehensive. He whined and looked back at Sarah, then at Rusty, who was sitting on the porch, watching the scene unfold. Rusty's expression was unreadable, but Sarah thought she detected a flicker of sadness in his amber eyes. Michael coaxed Shep into the crate, speaking to him in soothing tones. Shep settled down but kept his eyes fixed on Rusty. As Michael started the engine, Shep let out a soft bark as if saying goodbye. Rusty didn't move. He watched as the truck pulled away from the curb, Shep looking out the back window until the truck disappeared around the corner. A profound silence descended upon Sarah's yard. The absence of Shep's playful energy was palpable. Sarah put her arm around Rusty, feeling the cat's body tremble slightly. She knew he was feeling the loss too. "He'll be all right, Rusty," she said softly. "He's going to a good home and we'll still see him." Rusty looked up at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. He didn't purr or rub against her, but he didn't pull away either. He simply sat there, accepting her comfort and acknowledging the shared loss. The new beginning for Shep was also an ending, a farewell to a brief but meaningful companionship. The yard felt strangely empty. The vibrant energy of Shep, his playful barks and clumsy pounces, were replaced by a quiet stillness that pressed heavily on Rusty. He wandered through the familiar flower beds, sniffing at the spots where Shep had loved to roll and dig. The scents were fading, but the memories lingered, sharp and poignant. He went to the porch, expecting to find the usual bowl of food Sarah left out for him. It was there, filled with his favorite tuna, but he had little appetite. He ate a few bites, then sat down, staring out at the empty street. He missed the warmth of Shep's body pressed against his side, the playful nips, even the clumsy attempts to engage him in games. He missed the shared purpose, the unspoken understanding they had forged during their journey through the wilderness. He had never allowed himself to become attached to another creature, always prioritizing his independence and self-reliance. But Shep had broken through his defenses, leaving a void that ached with surprising intensity. Sarah came out onto the porch, carrying a cup of tea. She sat down beside Rusty, stroking his fur gently. She understood his sadness. She, too, felt the absence of Shep keenly. The house felt quieter, emptier, despite the fact that it had been just her and her late husband living together for decades. "He'll be happy, Rusty," she said, her voice soft. "Michael will take good care of him. He has a big farm, plenty of space to run and play." Rusty looked up at her, his amber eyes questioning. He didn't understand words, but he understood the tone of her voice, the reassurance she was trying to offer. He leaned into her touch, a rare display of affection. He stayed on the porch for a while, accepting Sarah's comfort, but restlessness soon returned. He was a creature of habit, of routine, and he needed to return to his familiar territory, to the life he had known before Shep had entered it. He licked Sarah's hand, a gesture of gratitude and farewell, then jumped off the porch and slipped into the shadows of the bushes. He didn't look back. Making his way back to the park, on the edge of Havenwood, the place where he had first encountered Shep, lost and terrified, the clearing was quiet, empty of the picnickers who had been there weeks before. The scent of cooked meat and human activity had long faded, replaced by the familiar smells of pine and damp earth. Rusty patrolled his territory, marking his boundaries and reasserting his dominance. He hunted, catching a moose and a small bird, eating to satisfy his physical hunger, but the emptiness inside remained. He found himself drawn to the edge of the woods, to the spot where he and Shep had first emerged, blinking in the sunlight and facing the daunting prospect of the town. He sat there for a long time, looking towards Havenwood, towards Sarah's house. He knew he could return to Sarah. She would welcome him, feed him, and provide him with shelter. But something held him back. He was a stray, a survivor, accustomed to relying on no one. He couldn't go back to being dependent, even on someone as kind as Sarah. He had been changed by his experience with Shep. He had learned about compassion, about connection, about the bittersweet pain of loss. He was no longer the same cat who had scavenged for scraps in the park, indifferent to the suffering of others. He had tasted the warmth of companionship, and that taste lingered, a bittersweet reminder of what he had lost. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Rusty turned away from the town and walked back into the woods, into the familiar solitude of his old life. He was alone again, but he was not the same. He carried the memory of Shep, of Sarah, of the kindness he had encountered. It was a memory that would stay with him, a subtle ache, a reminder of the unexpected connections that could be forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. He was a stray, yes, but he was a stray with a heart that had been touched, however briefly, by the warmth of friendship and the pain of loss. He continued to look for food, living his life alone, but now with a deeper understanding of what it meant to care for another.